Look at yourself in a mirror. Just for a second. Don't fix your hair, don't check your skin. Just look at your face. You probably didn't have to think about it. You didn't study your eyes, you didn't count your features. You didn't compare your nose to some picture stored in your head. You just looked and knew. That's me. It's such a basic feeling that most of us never even notice it happening. But imagine looking into that same mirror, seeing a face clearly, and still having trouble recognizing that it's yours. Not because you're blind, not because you've forgotten your name, not because you've lost your memory. The face is right there. Your eyes can see it. Your brain can process it. But somewhere between seeing the face and knowing who that face belongs to, something has gone wrong. This isn't a fictional story. Researchers documented a woman they identified as NG, a 65-year-old woman who developed prosopagnosia and difficulty recognizing herself after a left-sided temporo-occipital stroke. And her case revealed something I find genuinely unsettling. Seeing yourself and recognizing yourself are not the same thing. When NG came for neurological assessment, she wasn't simply complaining about memory. She had balance problems, visual difficulties, photophobia, and she couldn't reliably recognize faces. But there was one detail that made her case unusual. She reported difficulty recognizing her own face when she looked in the mirror. And even when she saw herself in photographs. Think about how strange that is. Someone you know walks into a room. You look at them. Normally, your brain does something almost instantly. That's your friend, that's your sister, that's your doctor. That's someone you haven't seen in years. You don't consciously calculate any of it. The face just gives you the answer. For NG, that visual route wasn't reliable. But interestingly, other information could help. She reported that recognizing people could be easier when she listened to their voice or focused on their facial expressions, such as a smile. So the person hadn't disappeared. Their identity hadn't vanished. Her brain simply wasn't getting the same information from the face that it used to. And then there was the face she should have known better than anyone. Her own. Think about your morning. You wake up. You walk into the bathroom. You turn on the light. And there you are. You don't need an introduction. You don't need someone beside you saying, "That's you." Your brain does it automatically. For NG, that automatic visual connection had become unreliable. And that's important because she wasn't simply unable to see. Researchers found that her visual object recognition was within the normal range, and she did not have a general visual agnosia. Her difficulty was much more specific to faces and bodies. That's what makes the case so interesting. The mirror wasn't broken. Her eyes weren't simply failing. She could see the image. But recognizing what that image meant was another matter. And that distinction becomes even more important when you realize what the researchers did next. They didn't just ask NG what she experienced. They tested it. The researchers photographed NG. They created photographs showing different facial expressions: neutral, happy, disgusted. Then they used those images in controlled visual matching tasks. The idea was incredibly simple. Show her one image, then show her other images. Ask her to determine which one matches. On paper, it sounds almost ridiculously easy. You look at two faces. One is yours, one isn't. Surely you'd know. But this is where the case became scientifically important. NG showed a marked impairment in visually discriminating her own face and body compared with other people's. The researchers found that the problem appeared not only when looking at the complete face, but also when processing individual face and body parts. And that tells us something very specific. The problem wasn't simply she forgot what she looked like. The researchers were testing visual discrimination. Could her brain tell one visual pattern from another? Could it identify her own visual features as belonging to herself? And the answer was significantly impaired. The face was visible, but the connection between that visual information and self wasn't working normally.
You've probably heard of prosopagnosia. It's often called face blindness. But that phrase can make the condition sound much simpler than it really is. A person with prosopagnosia isn't necessarily unable to see faces. They can see them. The difficulty is recognizing who those faces belong to. And NG's case was even more unusual. The researchers described her as having a relatively mild form of apperceptive prosopagnosia, mainly involving difficulties with processing face parts and body parts, rather than a complete inability to process whole faces. But her visual self-recognition was much more severely affected. That's a crucial distinction, because it suggests there isn't one simple switch inside your brain labeled face recognition. There are multiple stages. First, visual information has to be processed. Then, features have to be combined. Then the brain has to connect that representation to an identity. And in NG's case, the connection to her own identity appeared to be particularly vulnerable. So you can have a face you can see without having a person you can recognize. And in her case, even a face you can see without reliably recognizing it as your own. This is one of the details that makes the case feel less like a textbook and more like someone's actual life. NG reported that recognizing other people could be facilitated by listening to their voice. A familiar voice could give her something the face wasn't giving her. She also reported using facial expressions, such as a smile, as another clue. Think about what that means. Someone walks into the room. You look at them. Nothing immediately clicks. Then they speak, and suddenly, there's something familiar. Not because their face changed. They didn't become more recognizable. Your brain simply found another route to the person's identity. That's something we all do without realizing it. We use voices. We use movement. We use clothing. We use context. But most of the time, the face does the heavy lifting. For NG, that particular shortcut had become unreliable. And that gives us a glimpse of what the brain normally does for us, without asking permission. So what had changed? NG's difficulties followed a left-sided temporo-occipital stroke. When researchers mapped the damaged area, they found involvement of the left inferior occipitotemporal cortex, including the inferior occipital gyrus. They also found disruption of longer-range connections between occipital and temporo-occipital visual areas and more anterior frontotemporal regions involved in higher-level representations. And this is where the story gets much more interesting than the face part of her brain was damaged. That's not really how the brain works. The brain is a network. One region processes information. Another region connects it to something else. Different systems communicate, and eventually you get an experience that feels completely effortless. That's my face. NG's case suggests that visual processing of the face can be separated from the brain's representation of the self. The image can be processed, while the feeling of "this belongs to me" becomes impaired. And that's a much stranger problem than simply not seeing. There's something important we should be honest about here. The published case doesn't give us a dramatic diary of NG's life. It doesn't tell us that she cried in front of the mirror. It doesn't give us a story about her family reacting. And it doesn't give us a cinematic first-person quote. So I'm not going to invent one. But we do know what she reported.
Sometimes it is hard to focus.
Faces were difficult to recognize. Her own face could be difficult to recognize in mirrors and photographs. And voices or expressions could sometimes provide information that the face itself didn't. That alone changes ordinary social life.
We were just talking about
Imagine seeing someone you've known for years and having to wait for them to
Don't you
speak
remember me?
before their identity
We used to
becomes
play here
clear.
every summer.
Imagine looking through old photographs and having difficulty visually separating yourself from the people around you. Not because you've forgotten your life, not because you
tell me
don't know
name?
your
I
own
am
name,
Mrs. Grace.
but because the visual shortcut that normally tells you, "That's me," isn't reliable anymore. And that's the part that gets overlooked when we call something simply face blindness. This wasn't just about faces. It was about self-recognition. This is why researchers cared so much about one unusual patient. Because sometimes, a damaged brain teaches us more about a normal brain than a healthy one ever could. Most of us never notice the machinery behind self-recognition. We look in a mirror, we see a face, and our brain gives us the answer. Me. We don't experience the processing. We experience the result. That's the trick. Your brain doesn't hand you a list of visual measurements. It doesn't say, 2 eyes, 1 nose, 1 mouth. Facial structure detected. Identity comparison complete. It gives you one seamless experience. That's me. NG's case shows that this feeling depends on real neural systems. Systems that process visual information. Systems that represent faces and bodies. And connections that link those visual representations with the concept of self. Break part of that network, and something that felt permanent can suddenly become uncertain. There's a strange thing about looking at your own face. You can stare at it for 10 seconds, 20 seconds, even a minute, and yet you never experience it as a stranger. Somehow, almost instantly, you feel that the person looking back at you is you. That's the part NG's case makes impossible to ignore. The face remains. The mirror remains. The visual information remains. But the certainty, "This face belongs to me," can become fragile. And maybe that's what makes this case so unsettling. We spend our entire lives assuming that "I am me" is the most obvious fact in the world. But inside the brain, even that certainty has to be constructed. There's a reason this story stayed with me. Not because it's the strangest neurological disorder I've ever heard of, but because it takes something completely ordinary and makes you realize how extraordinary it actually is. You look in a mirror every day. You see a face. And without thinking about it, you know who you're looking at. You. NG's brain showed researchers that those two things aren't necessarily the same. Seeing a face and recognizing a face are different processes. And recognizing a face and recognizing yourself can be different again.
We spend our entire lives assuming that our identity is something solid, something permanent, something that simply exists. But neuroscience keeps showing us that the feeling of self depends on systems working together inside the brain. And when those systems are disrupted, even something as basic as recognizing your own face can change. So the next time you look into a mirror, take 1 second. Don't look at your hair. Don't look for flaws. Just look at your face. And notice how instantly your brain answers the question, who is that? You don't think about it. You don't calculate it. You just know. And maybe that's the most remarkable thing of all. Because you're not simply seeing a face. Your brain is telling you that the face belongs to you. And every time you look in that mirror, you're experiencing the result of a decision your brain is making so effortlessly that you never even notice it's happening.